Some of his poetry collections are from the core within. Then the door is half open, and his poems have been received well and has been translated in various Indian languages. So we welcome both the resource persons, and I hand over the session to Professor Sharma. Thank you. Sir?
Thank you, Pratyusha ji. I welcome all the participants and Professor Murray, who will be making a presentation. Since I do not have the topic before me, I'm not able to comment on that. The topic that had been listed here was storing the immobilities of GBV against older women in COVID-19 pandemic. Is that right, Professor Lesley Murray, or have you revised the topic?
No, that's correct. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So you are welcome to this conference, and you are welcome to make your presentations. During COVID-19, you must have seen so many visuals where people from Mumbai, Kolkata, etc., they were migrating to their native places in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. I hail from Uttar Pradesh, and so many people I received at my own place also. So I know about various kinds of difficulties that people face in the urban migrations. So let's hear from you what your experience and what your take is on the issue. Please.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm hoping, I haven't used this platform before, so bear with me. Let me just see if this works. Okay. Oh. Okay, that's not working, is it? So that's just showing. Okay, so hold on. Sorry, I am just, bear with me. I am going to work this out. I minimize that. Oh no, I can't do that. Sorry, can anyone give me any advice on sharing?
Professor Murray, when the connections are slow, sometimes this problem is there, so you once again may have to log in. No issues, and just wait for a few minutes.
Okay.
So you once again have to upload. You once again have to share the screen. Yes.
Okay.
So just wait for a while.
Okay. Is that working?
Sometimes the connectivity issues are there. We are able to see your slides on this side.
Oh, you can see
them. On the left side, but this main screen is not visible.
Okay. Oh, I see. Yes, yes, yes. Okay.
So on the left side, try clicking it. Yes.
Yeah. That's the one. Have you got it now? Okay, there we go. Can everyone, is that clear? Is that all right with everybody?
Yes, it's visible now.
Good. Okay, good. Thank you. And thank you so much for such a lovely introduction and for inviting me today. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. And as you said, my presentation today is on storing the immobilities of gender-based violence against older women. So I am going to start by introducing the topic. So in June 2021, the United Nations produced a report on the rise of violence against older women during the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, older women in care homes across the world faced an increase of neglect, isolation, and lack of adequate services. But the report also highlights the increase in gender-based violence against older women whose mobility is restricted due to the lockdowns. Studies of gender-based violence during the pandemic or beforehand do not tend to disaggregate according to age. But older people can be particularly exposed to gender-based violence by intimate partners, children, and carers. And older women are more likely to have a lifetime of gender-based violence experience. An online survey carried out in India by the AgeWell Foundation in June 2020 found that 71% of respondents felt that the lockdown had increased incidence of elder abuse. Studies have also found that crowded living spaces, such as those in refugee camps, can lead to an increase in gender-based violence. This paper draws primarily on a UK Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project that is analysing stories of gender-based violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it uses a mobilities approach to make sense of these stories in developing knowledge on gender-based violence against women. Today, I'm going to focus on gender-based violence against older women. In doing so, I set out to rethink ageing in generational terms in relation to generationed mobilities. And Lynn Pierce yesterday talked to you a little bit about the field of mobilities, and I'm going to be introducing that a little bit. So before specifically looking at gender-based violence and older women's experience in relation to stories, I will set the scene by considering how ageing and older people are conceptualized within the field of mobilities. I'm going to draw from some early work of mine on gender, generation and mobilities before looking at the concept of immobilities and how this can help make sense of gender and generationed experiences during the global pandemic. So I'm going to start with thinking about the field of transdisciplinary mobilities. So I'm not sure how much Lynn Pierce said yesterday, but the field of mobilities became prominent within sociology with John Urry's Sociology Beyond Societies, and this was called the mobilities turn. Here, mobilities is about large-scale movements of people, objects, capital, and information across the world, but also at a more local scale about the micro processes of daily movements of people and things in multiple spaces and at multiple scales, including at the scale of the body. Interdisciplinary work on mobility, sociology and humanities has zoomed in on the social and cultural processes of mobilities as well as imagined mobilities, of the self, of the others, and this can be through books, through film, through TV, social media, music and poetry. Merriman and Pierce suggest the term kinesthetics, through which scholars can examine how movement is enacted, felt, perceived, expressed, meted, choreographed, appreciated, and desired. Transdisciplinary work sets disciplines in dialogue with each other, and that's something that I am very interested in doing. So what can the mobilities field do for us in terms of making sense of the position we're in right across the world at the moment? Every country has particular challenges, and of course some are deeper than others. So in the early stages of the pandemic, mobilities researchers from across the world reflected on the pertinence of our field in making sense of this. There was a special edition of the journal Mobilities called Pandemic Immobilities, which began as the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus swept across the world in 2020, outpacing public health efforts to contain it. Many everyday human mobilities were brought to an abrupt halt, while others were drastically reorganized. The introduction draws from Keel, who talks about diseased bodies step out of the realm of the normal into the new normal of uncertainty, where the world they know is turned upside down. Here also lies the historical reality of the continued treatment of the diseased as foreign bodies through an often racialized, phantasmagoric representation that treats the sick body of an individual as an intruding threat to the supposed healthy national body. COVID-19 has raised awareness of the dangerous proximities of mobile bodies that have only amplified entrenched suspicions. And they're talking about this in the introduction to pandemic mobilities in relation to racializations of mobile labour, asylum seekers and refugees, but we can also think of the entrenched suspicions around the older body. It is in raising this awareness of immobilized bodies that is important in understanding generation, gender and gender-based violence. Immobilities is a concept within the field of mobilities, which is really important, I think, in understanding the impacts of COVID-19. It suggests a continuum of movement between stillness and speed, but it more so relates to the intermittent enabling and constraining of movement. So it's not only an absence of movement, but it's the constraining of movement in particular ways, both corporally, bodily and emotionally, set within a landscape of cultural, legal, gendered, national, political and personal. So it's set within the broader context, and it's about the changes in enabling mobilities and constraining it. But immobilities is a key term in conceptualizing the unevenness of movement and the control of others' bodies. It is particularly relevant in differentiating the mobilities of different generations and genders. So then we look at understanding aging through generation and generational mobilities. So this term generation is really important to me in beginning to or continuing this process of rethinking aging. And that is because generation represents this quite fluid concept. It's dependent on context and experiences of generational ascriptions and identities. Generation can be used as a conceptual basis for understandings of age as relational, situated in time and space. There are different and sometimes conflicting accounts of generation. Mannheim's theory was based on a theory of generation based on historic and politically formed groups and their shared experiences, which is something that I take on board in my conceptualizations. Generations by definition share experiences in shared socio-political and historical contexts. So their narratives are aligned to the particular cultural narratives of the time. Generation is socio-cultural. It's about different life experiences, different values, different politics, different mobilities. Generations are ascribed particular characteristics, including across cultures, despite cultural specificities. And this can often lead to generational blaming. But we can begin to challenge some of those assumptions around age by understanding why particular groups of people, distinguished according to age, may exhibit particular characteristics. And this is more to do with their shared histories, more than around competencies. And that can be, for example, around the use of technologies. Generations can inhabit the same social space with different practices, depending on their accumulated experience or mobility histories, and conflict or compatibility between them can produce particular practices and engagements with space. What is important here is that generation is not a linear stamp of historical time, but that we move back and forward through generations, both imaginatively and through social interrelations. We are nearly always in some way with another generation. So generational mobilities of the COVID-19 pandemic. As we can use this concept of generation and mobilities to understand the unevenness of impacts of the pandemic. COVID-19 is generationed. Older people are more likely to feel the impacts not only of the disease, but of the means of controlling the disease by controlling the movements of populations. So this is just one example of a story of an older woman. So during quarantine, my son and daughter-in-law began to neglect my needs, Previously, I did not notice their behaviour, but since all family members must stay at home, I started feeling their bad attitude to me. They don't give me food and medicine on time, and they don't even talk to me. Sometimes my daughter-in-law yells at me. I feel like a burden to my family. And this is a common story that we have seen across the world, in terms of, in particular, older people feeling isolated in their homes. And that can mean that they're isolated with other people that have in some way abused them or treated them badly. So generation illuminates what MacLeod refers to as the long view of time, as a continuum, so that we can join up the accelerations and decelerations that occur over different scales from the global to the local. Of course, we can look at, as an example of this, to the mobility of the COVID-19 vaccines over time and space, the hyper acceleration of vaccine development and approval in countries like the UK, which was aimed firstly at older people and then snowballing down through generations, compared, for example, with the slowness of the vaccine rollout in India, both because and despite it being the pharmacy of the world. There are spatial, temporal differentiations in the exporting of vaccines to other countries, indiscriminate private sector access, and accusations of widespread fraud in both the UK and India. The roots of the differential access between these two countries lies in colonialism and making the connections between the availability of vaccines on the global market. And the differential access of people to get vaccines can be made sense of by taking a mobilities approach that looks for the interdependencies across time and space. So the pandemic is also gendered, as well as being generationed. So as well as being marked out, people are more likely to feel the impacts of the pandemic according to their generation, but also according to their gender. And gender and generation are associated through mobilities with particular embodied encounters of space and time. So in terms of the pandemic being gendered, we can see right across the world escalating burdens for women who have more caring roles, are more involved with schooling, with working, with emotional labour. There's an increased risk of infection amongst women because there's a reliance on public transport. There's gender segregation in transport, in the transport industry, and women are often frontline and essential workers. We see economic impacts on women who are most likely to be in service industry jobs and therefore more likely to lose their jobs during lockdowns, and changing patterns of gender-based violence in the home, in work, in shopping centres and streets, online. Women are more likely to travel by public transport. There's a greater risk in contrast to the higher proportion of men travelling by the relatively safe option of the private car. So thinking about this idea of storying and where we start to kind of make these transdisciplinary links between my field and my discipline of sociology and humanities disciplines, and making links with literary scholars. So we can read gendered immobilities in fictional texts. In a transdisciplinary study of literary representation of women's mobilities in London, I worked with novelist Hannah Vincent and set out to understand more of imagined gendered immobilities. Taking our title, Are Women Moving Dangerously?, from Wendy Parkin's study of mobility as an expression of modernity in novels from the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, we asked the question, are women still moving dangerously? Our study was of novels set in London from the post-war period to the present day. These included Doris Lessing's Four Gated City, Valerie Avery's trilogy of London novels, London Morning, London Shadows, London Spring, Monica Ali's Brick Lane, and a concise Chinese English dictionary for lovers by Zhao Guo, and also Julie Marison's book novel Then. We found that women's identity was bound up in the mobile city, as the city is defined according to mobility. and that women's mobility is still imagined as risky, and women's role, as Wendy Parsons' study of modernity discussed, is still considered dangerous. And that, again, this is important in bringing through this an understanding of the uneven impact of gender-based violence and of the COVID-19 pandemic on gender, by gender and by generation. So the novels we analysed were predominantly about younger women journeying, although they were often set in the context of different generations. There are, and especially so in the UK, there are less novels about older women, especially autobiographical accounts. We have Helbrun's writing A Women's Life argues that women's experience is often reduced to what it should be in writing. And she points to the book of Marjorie Kemp, which was written in medieval times in 1436 to 1438. And this tells the story of gender-based violence in medieval Britain, and the story of Marjorie Kemp escaping from an abusive marriage by literally walking the Pilgrim's Trails. So the stories are definitely out there and they go back in time, but we are much less likely to find those. And again, I'm going to talk about why that might be a little bit later. So nevertheless, despite the absence of stories, it's become of paramount importance that we listen out for the fewer studies that there are, of the fewer stories that there are of older women, particularly around gender-based violence, and particularly in the context of the mobilizations of the pandemic. So thinking more about the way that the pandemic has impacted on experiences of gender-based violence around the world, a UN report last June described a worldwide increase in domestic abuse as a shadow pandemic that saw many victims trapped in the home with their abuser. The National Domestic Abuse Helpline in the UK received 49% more calls than usual in the week ending the 5th of April, which was during the first of the three major COVID-19 lockdowns we've had here. At the same time, a study by children's charity Plan International and the campaign group Our Streets Now found that 19% of young women and girls aged 14 to 21 in the UK experienced street harassment during the spring lockdown. But that rose to 51% during the summer as restrictions were lifted. So we have this landscape of gender-based violence where domestic abuse is increasing because people are more constrained, they're more immobilized in their homes, but that has contrasted by sometimes less street harassment or changing patterns of gender-based violence across different sites. And a study that I'm doing at the moment is looking at experience of gender-based violence across those different physical sites, across the spatial sites. So we are looking at storing gender-based violence in COVID-19 and adopting a trans-feminist, so a transdisciplinary feminist approach to create reflexive, collaborative stories of gender-based violence in the context of the pandemic. And also, we're also carrying out, so it's a kind of two-pronged approach, where we're carrying out also a narrative analysis of existing stories that are in the public domain. Stories have the ability to produce insights into contextual circumstances most people may not have experienced firsthand. So I think the storying particular experiences are a way of communicating to other people. Research exploring human stories is often considered as the flip side of established academic debates, able to challenge dominant societal narratives and carry rhetorical weight. They are highly appropriate, we have found, for feminist qualitative research seeking to challenge patriarchal and misogynistic discourse. So we are working with creative writers in this project and literary scholars as a transdisciplinary project, looking to tell stories that are sometimes go unheard. So as I was saying, one half of the project is looking at this collaborative reflexive storying, and we are telling mostly our own stories in the first instance. So we're drawing from French writer Georges Perec's autobiographical work, Je me souviens, which consists of a list of 480 memories, each beginning with the words Je me souviens, I remember. Perec's memories focused on the seemingly small or trivial. We use this method of writing in fragments, depicting one memory at a time, which is also evident in That Reminds Me by Derek Owusu, to create a set of seemingly disjointed experiences of gender-based violence that we had experienced at different stages in our lives. We took the long view, that idea from MacLeod of looking back over the long view of history, looking back to our childhoods and through our own generations. We found that the fragments represented a collective narrative. We found that we were immobilized, sometimes in motion and sometimes less so, by gender-based violence throughout our lives. The story as a whole, the collective narrative, illustrates the way in which gender-based violence is experienced across a range of spaces and throughout our life histories, and which shape our sensory relations with different spaces. We presented our storied fragments as partly fictions. They were about remembered events and sometimes require elaboration or restraint. The generational fragments fell into each other, but at the same time they were distinct in reflecting cultural narratives of the time. The analysis of the existing stories that went alongside this collaborative reflexive storying of our own experiences has illustrated that gender-based violence should be understood as a mobile and spatial phenomenon. So it cannot be fully understood without taking into account its multiple spaces and the ways in which it immobilizes people or limits and controls their movement. Mobilities is particularly important in understanding changes in patterns of gender-based violence in COVID-19. There's a surge in domestic violence and a decrease in street harassment and violence. This has been somewhat oversimplified, and the picture is, of course, much more complex. And we can understand that complexity by analysing these stories so that we can better inform policy and practice in a post-COVID world, if that ever happens, as well as during crisis, if we have an understanding, we understand more about this complexity. Attention to gender-based violence as a form of gendered mobility and justice also requires an intersectional approach, attending to both the dynamic nature of gender and its intersections with generation, race, sexuality, ethnicity, class, disability, and the dynamic nature of gender-based violence. As with crisis situations more generally, such as natural disasters, COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities, which include those associated with gender-based violence. IMCAN, which is an organisation looking and supporting people with who've experienced gender-based violence, have highlighted the dual pandemic of gender-based violence and COVID-19, both of which disproportionately affect Black and minoritized women and girls, who are frequently invisible in mainstream research and discourse about COVID-19 and gender-based violence. A number of groups have been identified as at greater risk of experiencing gender-based violence during the COVID-19 pandemic, and these include domestic workers, women with disabilities, and refugees and asylum seekers, and also older women. And this is one of those complex stories and intersectional stories, and this is Lolo's story. And Lolo says, I was in that accommodation for the start of this lockdown and I felt so unsafe there. I have serious mental health problems that mean it would be particularly dangerous for me to catch the virus, but it was impossible to self-isolate in that place. I was terrified because men kept coming into my room without permission, even while I was sleeping. I felt so stressed and my depression got worse. In the end, I felt too afraid to be there, so I left. For a week during lockdown, I slept on buses. I went from one side of London to the other because it was free to travel on the bus then. I didn't have any money for hand sanitizer or a face mask, but at least people were keeping their distance on the bus. So this is, you can see the immobilities in Lolo's story. And that is a quite common one, particularly in women who are refugee or asylum seekers in the UK. Lockdown tends to immobilise and mobilise different groups of people, particularly mobilising those offenders or perpetrators of gender-based violence. And this is an example of a stark impact of COVID-19 lockdown and restrictions. So in June 2021, 4 women reported their experience of sexual harassment at a number of different COVID-19 quarantine hotels in the UK, where travellers are required to stay for 10 days when they return from red list destinations. The security guards, who were employed by a private company, G4S, had harassed them verbally and physically and encroached on their personal space, including walking up and down the corridor outside their rooms. And so one of the women said, "I couldn't believe it, really. I was so shocked and just shut the door straight away. I called my mum and she's saying I need to report him, but I'm scared to do that as I already told him, and he's still around my room. I feel very uncomfortable. They know I'm by myself and the hotel is full of male security guards." So an example there of how the quarantine and the enforced immobility of the quarantine had put a particular group of women at particular risk from a group of men who had a lot of control over them. Lockdown immobilises offenders as well as those who are experiencing GBV, and of course this can be used as almost an excuse for abuse. So a recent article in the Guardian newspaper in the UK looked at femicide amongst women aged 60 and over. And they asked why society is failing these victims. It tells the story of 67-year-old Ruth Williams, who was killed by her husband, Anthony Williams, at the beginning of the first lockdown in the UK, in their home. Anthony Williams claimed diminished responsibility on the basis that he had found the lockdown really hard. And he'd attacked his wife because she used the words "get over it" when he was telling her how hard it was. He was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility and was sentenced to what is a very short sentence of 5 years in prison, with the likelihood that he will get out of prison within a year. So, as I was saying, there are stories. We've been collecting existing stories of experience of gender-based violence during the pandemic, but there are, unfortunately, a lot fewer studies from older women than from younger women. But this is one example of a story from an older woman. So this is Grace's story. Grace is 81 years old. She's endured 57 years of physical and sexual abuse and financial and emotional coercive control by her husband, George. And this is her story. When I was 22, I met George. He was handsome and charming. He showered me with compliments and made me feel wonderful. However, he controlled every penny and decided what I wore and how I arranged my hair. George would return from the races smelling of whiskey. If he'd won at the races, we'd dance and he'd treat me to a bottle of port. If he'd lost, he'd treat me to a beating. When the children left home, George allowed me to have a part-time job. I started to gain confidence. George noticed the change in me and began treating me differently. He even bought me a cat. I adored Misty and she followed me everywhere. But one evening, George whispered in my ear, what would he do to Misty if I ever left him? He repeated that threat hundreds of times over the coming years. His memory has started to fail now. He's getting frustrated and angry. Thankfully, problems with his hip mean he can't manage the stairs anymore, so he sleeps downstairs. and allows me to sleep upstairs. So this is, she goes on to say that nighttime is my favourite part of the day. I can rest knowing he can't get to me and feel safe for the first time in years. I lie in bed and my thoughts are completely my own. So this is the story of Grace, of a lifetime of gender-based violence, of being in a particular generation that where she felt, due to the cultural narratives of the time, she was unable to do anything about it or to get out of the situation that she was in. She felt completely immobilized at different times throughout her life. And in fact, it's kind of ironic that she feels most freed and most mobilized when her husband gets so frail that he can't get up the stairs, and she has this escape when she's upstairs in bed. At the same time, the experiences felt by older women are invisibilized. So the Crime Survey of England and Wales does not count women over 74 years in the figures for domestic abuse. Up until 2018, it did not include women over 59 years old. Evidence from data collected by Karen Ingler-Smith in the Femicide Survey suggests that 278 women aged 60 and over were killed in their homes between 2009 and 2018. As Hannah Bowes, a researcher at Durham University studying violence against older women, said, when you look at police data on abuse, rape and murder, older women aren't there. If the crime is looked at all, it's treated as a safeguarding, gender-neutral elder abuse with no perpetrator. So we have this situation in which, very surprising to me when I was looking at this issue, that women over 74 are just completely invisibilized from the statistics around abuse in the UK. This was the subject of a question to the House of Lords on the 29th of July last year. And the question was to ask Her Majesty's government what plans they have to ensure that any data collected on domestic abuse includes the abuse of women over at the age of 74. And the response was, my lords, the government recognise that the over 74s can be victims of domestic abuse, and we are committed to supporting all victims. The Crime Survey for England and Wales collects data on victims of domestic abuse. And the most recent assessment of data collection methods did not support raising the age limit for respondents above 74 due to lower response rate. However, the Office for National Statistics will continue to review the upper age limit. So you might find that quite a surprising response, that because there was no there was a lower response rate amongst a particular group of people, they weren't raising the age limit, even though there is quite a lot of academic data with people of an older age group, which shows that they experience abuse, but that it is considered differently, that it's considered to be that sometimes older people aren't believed, and because their kind of mental capacities are questioned, and so the abuse is not considered as abuse, and quite often the response to that is to medicalize it, is to give the older person drugs, or to put them in a care home. And of course, then you also have, when older people know that that's going to be the response, they're going to resist that, and that's going to make them much less likely to tell their stories. And this is this absence of stories is something that's really important to push back against, to listen carefully to, listen out carefully for those stories that do exist. So I'm going to just go to our I don't think I said earlier that a part of the study that we're doing as part of our collaborative reflexive analysis and collaborative reflexive storying of our own stories of gender-based violence. And you might think, you know, we're not necessarily a group of older women, but, you know, we are a group of aging women, and we've had lifetimes of experience of gender-based violence, and we told those in the fragments, the fragmented stories, the fragments that made up this collective story of gender-based violence over our lifetimes. We also created a poem based on our experiences, and we used renga, which is the Japanese poetic form used in in our feminist collaborative storying, and it's a method of poetry, collaborative poetry, that's been used in a lot of other projects as well. But because of we used it because of social distancing and lockdown restrictions, and we couldn't meet in person, so we were seeking to find a form of collaborative poetry or collaborative storying that we could use where we didn't need to be together. So this form of poetry allowed us to do that. We took it in turns to write a tanka, which is a stanza, and email it to the next researcher. So there was 5 of us all together. And each tanka responded to a word, image or theme from the previous stanzas that the other researcher had written. We read through the growing number of stanzas before writing and allowed the poem to unfold. And I think this is quite important in reflecting the way that lives unfold, and that how we, you know, take on the stories of other generations and think back in terms of our own life stories and look at the generations that we've come through. So these were polyvocal collaborative poetry, and we found that using this form of poetry, no one voice is privileged over another, and we don't fall into the danger of listening to and believing that there is a single story. The nature of research collaboration and regular meetings online was an important connection during the pandemic, which caused people stress, depression, anxiety, anger, boredom, uncertainty, loneliness, including researchers. So this collaborative autoethnography was an important alternative research approach, a transdisciplinary research approach, because, of course, in our team, we're working with me as a sociologist, but working with criminologists who had never done any creative writing before, and also with 2 creative writers. So I would like to introduce you to our renga poem, which is called Silent Footsteps, and which tells our story of experiences of lockdown and looking back and over our experience of gender-based violence. So, lockdown walk, I would lose myself to bluebell haze, blackbird song, cracked mud, but buried deep in my mind, behind a stop sign, lives fear. Regardless I walk, no sounds, no chatter of life, like clocks pushed forward. Eeriness hangs in the air, missing the eyes on the street. I've walked here a lot, it's my own neighbourhood, but at night it changes. Monsters out and angels home, alert from my lookout post. Even when I'm still, at home alone in my house, violence seeps in. Another young woman killed, read the news, could have been you. Your hand reaches back across the years, finds me in my lockdown. Memory bangs hard on my door, but you're only scant vapour now. Instructions to self. Walk as if you own the street. Look straight ahead. Listen for silent footsteps. Give them what they want. Let go. Readjust my mask. Shout, but no one to speak a word. Hold it all to me, the outside and the inside, and all that is in between. Streets are deserted. We are all locked down now. Both angels and monsters equally curfewed, and yet harms unequally shouldered. I hear stories and I tell my stories too. Listen, listen, speak. They gather like clouds as I walk, keys gripped between fingers. Her head haloed in half sun at dusk, striding out across the meadow. Hey babe, 2 men whoop and yell, break her spell, take her moment. Break her spell, spirit, stride, silence, thoughts, peace of mind. Break rules, promises, break her trust, break her heart, break bones, break up, break down, break her. Entering the scene, he peers through trembling fingers, hearing all of it, motionless and powerful, not acknowledging his part. A silent presence, a present silent, but there I can feel his breath. He will never speak to me, but he will kill me, mightn't he? Uncertainty seeps. Not all men, they say again. Some men are good men, but in the streets in the dark, it could be him, you. In the queue for Pfizer, Anne blames the door, her weak knee for the new bruises. Not the man in her home who says her fault every single time. Immune now, she leaves, smiling at security, removes mask, inhales. Slow exhale, one step forward, then one more. She decides it's time to take back control, to set the wheels in motion. Rage from the streets to the streets. It's an epidemic, rage. From whispers to shouts, our voices get louder. Anger on our lips. Women whose stories must be heard. We won't stop now. So that is our Renga, which we hope is about not only our experiences now, but our experiences of the past and to some extent looking forward. And so this is important to understanding older women's experience of GBV, of gender-based violence, because what we're proposing is that the experience of GBV is cumulative. And we can go back to the conceptualization of generation, where I've talked about each generation not sitting in isolation and space, but absorbing the shared cultures of time and space through the course of life, collecting experiences that are remembered according to both the time in which they were first felt and all of the times that they've been remembered in the past, so that new experiences are encumbered with all of these past experiences as we imagine all of those past experiences. The immobilizations of older women experiencing GBV, gender-based violence, which has been illuminated by the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns and by their stories, are not only burdened by their lifetime experiences, but as I talked about, they are invisibilized and devalued in the present. We can, of course, do something about this. We can listen out for older women's stories. We can seek to understand those stories and to understand the ways in which gender-based violence is experienced, but is also resisted by all generations, including older women. Thank you very much. That's
Thank you very much, Professor Lesley Murray. It was a nice presentation where you talked about gender-based violence, GBV, particularly faced by older women. You started talking about the report of the UNO regarding older women during COVID times. And you referred to India also, then you moved on to transdisciplinary mobilities, then real imaginary kinesthetics and transdisciplinarity. Then you also brought in the issue of normal and new normal realms and generational mobilities, and how these generational mobilities have got to be contextualized in certain opportunities and time spaces. And the issue of competencies was also brought in. You then moved on to various fictional accounts of Doris Lessing, Monica Ali, and many other novelists. And besides that, you moved on to other newspaper reports because not very many stories were there, fictionalized stories were there. So you went on to the actual stories that had been published in the newspapers. And when these stories were not enough for your data, you started conducting your own experiments. You moved on with your own stories and tried to involve people by writing poetry and their own stories and publishing them and trying to draw certain analogies and certain data. Now, this context, naturally, you have very well identified that there's a feminist take on the gender-based violence that we have talked about. Uh, for the benefit of the audience, particularly the young research scholars who are present here, there are a large number of groups which also claim to be anti-feminists. So, feminist stories on one side and the anti-feminist stories on the other side. I would especially refer to this story of I and George that she talked about, that the husband is sleeping downstairs, the wife is sleeping upstairs, both of them are happy. But this husband is also passing through a phase of agony, and the woman does not seem to be careful about that agony. So masculinists and the anti-feminists, they try to read the very same story from a different perspective. And they try to say that whatever social order is there, that social order is being broken or is under attack by these feminists. And perhaps some of them say that they are going perhaps too far in developing a new kind of social order which is so powerless that it cannot replace the existing one. In India, however, we have got a different situation. For example, Arun Shuri, one-time minister in the BJP government, he was posted once upon a time in the United States. And his son was born and he was suffering from cerebral palsy. And when he took him to the doctor said, well, you are from India and I hear that in India combined families are there. This problem is going to worsen as the age of this child grows. And Arun Shuri believed his word. He came back with his son to India, and the entire family was devoted. The two generations devoted themselves to serve this cerebral palsy affected boy, young boy, and his grandmother will spare no efforts in teaching him mathematics. And Arun Shuri says that sometimes people will ask her, what do you gain by teaching such a boy mathematics? And the grandmother said, well, the kind of smile that sometimes I see when he is able to solve a problem or is able to add up, that gives me a kind of a joy, which I do not get anywhere else. So this kind of care in a joint family system, which is an alien concept to the Western world, this type of stories sometimes are out of context in India and perhaps are not appreciated very much. Although I'm going too far, not appreciated, sometimes I simply say that people are not able to relate to them properly. Particularly those who are located in small towns or in the villages. Whatever migration we saw from Mumbai, from Delhi, all these people, they were returning to their homes. And the mothers will go to the fields and they will bring their sons home at night, despite the fact that there used to be some resistance from the other villagers. So this kind of help that the mothers who are giving to their sons and to their husbands stealthily during the night, and sometimes despite the fact that there was some resistance from the local people, but everybody was able to pass through that phase, and we were somehow able to control this COVID and the least number of deaths, as were reported from India, keeping in the largest population density. So we also need to look at as to why this sort of thing was happening. There is a personal story, the personal story of one of my teachers. He was a retired man, naturally, around the age of 80. And he had been diagnosed with COVID. He was sent to the hospital, and no one was being allowed to meet. We went to his family, and his wife was worried. Nobody can see my husband. What will happen? In this situation, he has never lived. On the contrary, my wife has written a short story in Hindi regarding an old woman who is left back by the family in a fair in Allahabad. Generally, when older people uh, uh, become unmanageable, so the sons and daughters sometimes will deliberately drop them here, and they'll be declared as lost. Uh, and the elderly people, sometimes they are not able to tell even their addresses, so they are lost forever. So different kinds of stories are there in this world. Anyway, it was a nice presentation, and I enjoyed Professor Lesley Murray. I'm sure many of the participants will be ready to ask questions or make certain observations. So the paper is open for discussion. Your comments, your questions, your observations are most welcome. You may ask them, and you may also type them out in the chat box. Pratyusha, are there some questions in the chat box?
Sir, I don't see as of yet.
Okay.
Let us give some time to the participants to frame their
Okay,
questions, maybe.
okay. So in the meanwhile, Professor Lesley Murray, you may have to say something more. I can see your cat behind.
That's a dog.
Black cat. Oh, that's a dog. Black dog.
Dr.
What?
Yeah, lots of animals who become part of your life when you start working from home in lockdown.
That's the case here also.
Yeah.
How do you address this dog?
Sorry?
How do you address him? What's his name?
Billy. He's Billy.
Belay. I see. So a female or a male?
He's
From
male.
The male, but the name gives the impression that he's a female.
Oh.
Well, yes.
Yeah, Billy's more of a common male name here. So
I see.
People are appreciating the paper, but I don't see any questions or any kind of other things. Responses.
So I think people are appreciative of your paper, and in case there are some questions, they will be directed to you through Pratyusha and Professor Patra, and I hope you'll be able to tackle all those questions through email.
yes, definitely. I'm very happy to have any conversations by email or yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So
Thank you
Pratyusha
for
ji,
having me.
so
Okay.
Pratyusha ji, anything else?
So it's fine. I think yes.
So thank you. Professor Lesley Murray. It was nice interaction. It was nice to be introduced to you and listen to your stories, various kinds of stories, real stories and imaginary stories. Thank you very much. I hope to stay in touch with you, and I'm sure that during the COVID times, you will be taking care of yourself and other members of your family. Stay safe, stay happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The same to all of you. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, for your wonderful presentation, for throwing, for enlightening us with such information and such valuable insights, and on this very important topic of gender-based violence during the pandemic. So I think that is something that has given a new dimension to the webinar altogether, because that was something that needed to be addressed. So thank you so much. And I also express my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Sharma for chairing this session, and also for his valuable insights, to the present, for his insights on the presentation that Professor Moore just, presented. So thank you, sir. And so we have come to the end of the session. So I'll move on to the next session, the last
Thank
session
you.
of the day. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Pratisha,
Yes, sir.
and
Thank
your
you very
entire
much.
team. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye. So we move on to the next session. The last session, technical session of the day, and the session will be chaired by Dr. S.J. Wari, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of English, Kokrajhar Government College, Kokrajhar, BTR, Assam. So we have lots of presentations in this session. Let me read out the names of the presenters. Bornobijoy Bosumotari, Vicky Chomo Bhutia, Nichira Bosumotari, Nilim Mohan, Sagarika Kotoki, and Ruisumi Brahma has already presented in the previous session. So these are the name of the presenters. So we welcome Dr. S.J. Wari, and I hand over the session to him, sir.
Good afternoon to everyone. So welcome to this the last technical sessions of the webinar, and so without making any delays, let us start the technical sessions. First of all, our paper presenter is Mr. Borno Bijoy, Assistant Professor, Gosagon College. I don't know whether he is present or not. Is he present, Mr. Borno Bijoy, Assistant Professor, Gosagon College? Okay, so then I request you to present your papers in this session.
Hello.
You are not audible.
Hello. Hello.
Hello. You are not
You are
audible.
audible. You are audible. You present your paper.
Okay.
Sir, just a little thing that I want to mention to Dr. Wari. There is another presenter, Antara Chaudhuri and Dr. Shreyashi Mukherjee, the last presenter. I forgot to mention the name, so please note that down.
Antara
Chaudhuri and Dr. Shreyashi Mukherjee.
Shreyashi, no?
Yes, sir.
Shreyashi Mukherjee. Okay. Antara Muzumdar.
Sir, you can also mention.
And Dr. Shreyashi. Yes. Please.
Like to be a part of this wonderful international seminar. Generally, sir, our topic is always related to core literature, but today the topic is a little different and unique to some extent, in the connection between science, geography, and literature. So, without much ado, I start. My topic is environment in relation to aging, disease, and death. As you all know, our environment around us influences us in more than one ways. The overarching impact that surrounding them on humanity is indistinguishable with many theories proving the same. Earth is then a sphere of life that is not been touched by nature, be it topography, climate, physiography, terrain, crops, and other hydrological factors. All these together form a whole in turn, influences human lives in unthinkable, unbelievable, and unimaginable ways, maybe short term and long term. Human
Sir, he is disconnected. He has a network issue, sir. Let us wait. For
Yes,
minutes.
he's not audible, not clearly audible.
He has
So-
network issue, sir. He will rejoin, sir.
And,
Yes, yes.
What should we do now, sir? Shall we move on and let him present later on?
Sir, let him give 2 minutes, sir. Let us give him 2 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Next paper reader, please get ready yourself. Next paper reader, please get ready yourself.
Yeah.
So he
Yes,
has
next paper reader is
network issue.
Diki Chomu. Next paper reader is Diki Chomu Bhutia. Yes, be ready.
Sir, you can call next presenter, sir.
Okay,
Sir,
then
you can call
we
next presenter, sir.
move. Yes,
Yes, sir, yes.
let's move on to the next presenters. If networks becomes okay, so then we can give him another chance at the end of the session. Now, Diki Chomu Bhutia, doctoral candidate at Sikkim University. Diki Chomu Bhutia, doctoral candidate at Sikkim University. Please.
He is not present, sir. He is not
He is
present.
not present.
No, sir. Next, sir.
Okay, then I will
Antura, you please invite Antura, sir.
As Antura Choudhury.
You invite
so Antura Choudhury is.
Antura Choudhury, you can present now.
Oh yes, you can present now.
Sir, there are two more presenters before Antara, Nilim Mohan and Sagarika Kotoki. Since Nijera is will not be able to present because of her medical emergencies.
Who else?
Nilim Mohan, I saw the participants a while ago. Nilim Mohan, if he is there.
Yes, I'm present, ma'am.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Okay, yeah. Go on then. Move.
It's good to go serially, sir. So that is why I mentioned.
Yeah.
Yes.
So a very good afternoon to all. My name is Nilim Mohan, and I am a research scholar in Department of English, Dibrugarh University. The title of my paper is Reimagining Life and the Existence of Hope in Albert Camus' The Plague. As we all know, pandemic in literature have nowadays taken a crucial role. Many books and many movies are being made with the motif of pandemic or disaster in literature. More than being just a name in literary discourse, it has become a sort of symbolism. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year is one of the most well-known contributions. Through the role of the pandemic, it can be said the writer tries to show the human side of an inhuman side of pandemic. It actually examines the face and the strength of humanity in front of such a huge trouble or tragedy. As the lines from Daniel Defoe's work says, the face of London was strangely altered, which reveals the hypocrisy behind the side of human nature. Another of the works which skillfully portrays this theme is The Plague by Albert Camus. As the name suggests, the novel focuses on a disaster which comes as a sort of calamity and also as a test in the lives of people. The setting is in the town of Oran, and a bubonic plague soon starts infecting the town. The townspeople and their response to the plague is the main center of the play. The main protagonist, Dr. Bernard Rioux, is shown as a man of extraordinary capabilities. Throughout the novel, he is shown as the only man whose course of actions and discussions can be shown to be quite rational. He represents the helplessness of man in front of death and also symbolizes a ray of